I think what scares me the most about this particular segment is that I have been literally saying the same things for years. And now you have an expert validating everything that I've said in regards to Trump courting the Pentecostals. This is terrifying, you guys.
What Trump did is he kind of merged these two groups together. So you've got like the Paula Whites, the more global Pentecostal religion. And that's where we get this bringing in, especially of the end times, and this sense we've got to defend ourselves for these coming end times. Certainly a weapon that has been used for a long time to justify a lot of corrupt religious leadership.
I'm Ken Harbaugh.
What could possibly go wrong?
What is this?
This is Burn the Boats, a show about making tough calls in tough times. America today faces a critical test. Our democracy is under threat. But good people are rising to the challenge. Now is the time to go all in. Now we burn the boats.
Okay. I don't know what that means, but let's go.
My guest today is Angela Danker, a Lutheran pastor and journalist. Her book, Red State Christians, takes a hard look at white Christian nationalism and the evangelicals who voted for Trump. Angela, welcome to Burn the Boats.
Hi.
I think, you know what, I know he keeps referring to them as evangelicals, which, and quite frankly, so does the media, right? They keep, and I have on occasion as well. But I think the important thing about this segment is that the people who are doing the crazy stuff are not necessarily evangelicals, because evangelicals are not as far off base as Pentecostals. Pentecostals think that the end of the world is coming, like right the fuck now. And they have bastardized Christianity to the point that they can make up anything in their heads. That's what's happening. And she's going to explain that.
Thanks for having me.
You published an updated version of Red State Christians after the events of January 6th, but it was way back in 2019, which seems like a lifetime ago, that you were one of the first to dive deep into Christian nationalism. Can you give us an idea of what that term means? And if you could do it by sharing the story which opens your book of what 4th of July celebrations look like at the mega churches you visited, because I think that imagery, the flag and the cross side by side, that captures Christian nationalism better than just about any statistics we might be able to come up with.
Yeah, absolutely. The beginning story of Red State Christians started out what feels for me now like a very naive place for me, and even for my publisher. They came to me with this idea, and hindsight's 2020 when you look at all this. But their initial idea was they had seen the success of hillbilly elegy, and they're like, we want to do the Christian hillbilly elegy, which was, we've seen a lot of changes since then with what's happened with J.D. Vance. But so I, set out on this journey to really, my impetus, my goal was to tell stories and to talk to the people who weren't getting a chance to share their stories in the national media, particularly just everyday Christians, rural Christians, as well as some prominent leaders. But I began my journey at the March for Life, and at the March for Life spoke with a pastor from Florida who was then a member of the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention. He's the one who pushed me on Christian nationalism. And I really have to credit him with, kind of busting my naivety and saying, this is a gospel distortion in the church right now. And so he was the one who said, if you really want to understand this, you got to go to Prestonwood Baptist Church in Plano, Texas, just north of Dallas, on 4th of July weekend. And so that's what I did. And that's ended up being how the book began and shaped so much, like you say, of what you see in the rest of the book is so much of it ties back to Christian nationalism. And we've seen that in the years to come as well.
It's the elevation of the state to, well, it's like physically placed on the altar. You have the cross side by side with the flag. You have the Pledge of Allegiance recited in church. And an interesting footnote there, the under God part. And, I grew up in an evangelical tradition, and I've been to events where people literally yell the under God part of the Pledge of Allegiance as kind of an FU to everyone else. And that wasn't even part of the original pledge. I mean, something has changed. This is not the emergence of an undercurrent that's always been there. It's something new, and I would argue, as you do, sinister, and it's a perversion of the gospel.
Here's some reasons why some people may not go.
Yeah, and one thing I thought maybe we can talk about today too. I know your record of military service, and thank you for your military service. I come from a family of military veterans as well. And I would say the thing that really struck me the most when I was attending that service is the way that they used the military to justify sort of this Christian nationalist state. And what bothered me, as a person, I also served as a chaplain at the Minneapolis Veterans Hospital, was the way in which it used military members as props. And so they would show these montage scenes of the American military in combination with scenes of Jesus' death on the cross. And for me, it was this direct comparison of saying that military death and sacrifice is analogous to Jesus' sacrifice. And for me, it just so ignores the individual stories of military veterans. It doesn't allow each person who served to have their own unique story. And it really uses the military in a way that I saw, Donald Trump really latch onto that with military symbolism as well. We saw that as he's, standing in front of a church after George Floyd.
And, honestly, the irony of this is that for all those people out there who are trying to spread the gospel, right? She talks about the church. Most Catholics believe that the church is the Catholic Church, and that Protestants are people who disputed the message of the Catholic Church. Christians, we are Christians. They don't consider us Christians, right? But using imagery this way is very manipulative. As far as I know, I've not been to a single Catholic church that has ever done anything that manipulative. But they use religion to manipulate people into believing that they are somehow going to be saved. I'm going to have, I'm going to be able to be seated at the right hand of the Father, so on and so forth. If I pick up arms, fight for my country, this is some bullshit, conflation. That's not how religion works. Because Jesus never, he was never in support of government. He simply said, hey, if Caesar wants you to pay taxes, pay some taxes. But that doesn't have anything to do with what we're doing as religious people who want the salvation of God. These are unrelated activities. And so the fact that they keep conflating this is very disturbing, very manipulative. I do like that she's a theologian, right? She's a Lutheran, so she's probably German. Probably came from a similar family for me. That was like a farmer family. Had some guns for hunting. But not for aggression. That's not how you do it. Like, what's wrong with you people? Oh my God.
So that was really troubling for me at that service as well.
So you're describing a symptom, but I've got to ask where that glorification of, and I'll just say it out loud, that glorification of violence, of the righteous warrior imagery, where does that come from? Because it's not in Scripture, at least it's not in the New Testament. How did the evangelical church of today adopt such a militant attitude towards Christianity?
There's a lot of perceived cultural losing. and it comes from a lot of different places. So I want to, not, that was one of my goals in the book as well, is like, let's not tell one story for this whole movement and one story for the people within this movement, because there's multiple stories. There's certainly, one of my reasons for updating the book in 2022 was that the role of, I think that in the initial edition, I probably underplayed the role of race and just this sense of racial anger, racial violence, for many white Americans, seeing the country becoming more diverse, seeing the presidency of Barack Obama as a perceived threat. I think that history of racial violence and anger in America certainly becomes a part of this, and becomes a part, in many denominations, such as the Southern Baptist Convention, that were founded in the wake of the loss of the Civil War and the end of slavery. So that's a player. It's not the only player. When I went to places like Appalachia, I saw, and I've seen within my own family and my own congregation that I served in rural America and on farms, there is this real story of despair, sort of economic despair that was maybe touched on a bit in Hillbilly Elegy.
Hang on a second. I gotta move locations. Okay, let's get back to it.
And I do think that, and for me, as a journalist, it's this sense for people that they don't matter, they don't count, their voices aren't being heard. Some of that's perception, some of it is reality, some of it's a result of economic issues. So I think those things are all a part of it. And as you stated, very little of that has to do with Jesus.
I want your insight on that, because you just gave a great journalistic answer, and from like a cultural anthropology perspective, that's super insightful. But you're an expert on scripture, and what is the scriptural basis for this fetishization of the military, for the worship of guns? How do they justify that when they're literally thumping the Bible every Sunday at the altar?
There's a way of reading the Bible that's very popular in Christian nationalism. And, for me as a female pastor, a lot of folks don't think women should be pastors, will say, that the Bible is necessarily masculine, that God is necessarily masculine. And along with that comes an honoring and a sacralization of violence. So we saw that with the rise of pastors like Mark Driscoll of Mars Hill out in Seattle. When I was first starting out in ministry, the pastor I worked with was a huge fan of Mark Driscoll, and this sense that the church has become feminized, and we need to militantly take back the church. If you're asking for a scriptural support for that, I don't think you can necessarily find it. But as a Lutheran, for me, as a Lutheran pastor, Martin Luther said, all of scripture and all of religion is about interpretation. Nobody has like the one truth of scripture. And so everything we do is interpreted by Jesus' revelation, by prayer, and by discernment, by study. And so there is room for debate on Bible passages. And I think, to deny that and to say, well, no, this one interpretation is correct is not biblical or factual.
How does anticipation of the end times, the eschatology of the modern evangelical church, factor in? Because when you think about allusions to violence or descriptions of violence in the New Testament, they're few and far between, but they exist. There's obviously the crucifixion, but they really reach their peak in the book of Revelation. And I have this habit of listening to AM radio on long drives, not just, in Ohio, but when I travel around in the South in particular. And that is...
He's not wrong. First of all, she's very sad. Like you can hear it in her voice. She's very sad about the state of what's happening in America right now, with religion being manipulated to religion being used to and bastardized to manipulate people and get them to vote for aggression, which is absolutely antithetical to what religion is. It's supposed to be about loving your neighbor and doing good in the world and being good people. And that if you're expressing such hostility and hurting the people around you, most religions, most Christian religions, believe that you will either go to hell or you'll go to, why am I forgetting this right now? It's it's like this in between place, right? Where you have to be there until you can figure it out. And then you either go one way or the other. I think that's a Catholic thing, though. Um, this is all. This is why we have so many atheists, by the way, because these belief systems are so over the top, and they were supposedly communicated through prophets, right? But then you have different religions that believe different things. Like there's certain religions that are like for instance, Catholicism said that there will be no more prophets after Jesus, right? Like he's going to be the last one. I think Muslims believe that Jesus was a prophet, but that he wasn't the Christ. He wasn't the Son of God, right? I think that's what they believe. I'm not an expert in this stuff, but I think that's where we're going. But because there's so many different belief systems out there, and they all have kind of these over the top stories, because at least 3 of the main religions are based on the Old Testament. They all hold the Old Testament as part of, and well, you could consider 4 if you want to throw Mormon in there, because they also have the Book of Mormon, right? They all have the Old Testament, which they might call it different things, but they all have those particular books. And some of these stories are so over the top. I mean, I've seen some scientific explanations for this on like either the History Channel or Discovery Channel years ago. I used to watch that stuff all the time. But this is why we have atheists, because like there's a lot of people. My ex-boyfriend became an atheist at 8 because he started asking some serious questions of his mother, who was a Jehovah's Witness. But how did they only have 2 of each animal and they all fit on an ark, and God just let everybody else die? That seems weird. All right, let's see what else they have to say.
A pretty resonant theme across just about everything I listen to coming out of evangelical movements today.
Yeah, there's a very present sense of fear. And, of course, Jesus says perfect love casts out fear. But this sense of fear within the movement of Christian nationalism is what really holds people captive to it. And I really got the biggest sense of that sense of fear, not in Dallas, not in this Christian nationalist center necessarily, but really when that was coupled with weapons. So the 3rd chapter of the book is on guns. And I visited more of a Pentecostal church in Florida.
Well, I would disagree with you there, because I've gone to the evangelical church in my sister-in-law's community in Arizona, which is probably, I mean, it's Mesa. It's probably a more rational part of the country than some of the Bible Belt areas. And we went there for Christmas Eve, and they did an entire production about the second coming of Christ and the book of Revelations. So yes, that fear is propagated through many, many churches, regardless if they're as extreme as Pentecostal folks or if they're just evangelical. But I think this idea of it's more than just like incorporating guns into the situation, which I don't actually, I do think I saw people packing because it was Arizona and they have open carry there. But the bigger thing was it was just trying to make it like a Starbucks. Like everybody could come in with their coffee. You had a rock band playing on the stage. They're they're trying to repackage religion in such a way that they can get their message across, but they're like, okay, well, these people are lazy now and they can't. I'm, I'm sorry, like, y'all, I grew up Catholic. I was told I could not eat 1 hour before church when I was a kid because my grandparents were so militant about the Catholic religion that they didn't even recognize Vatican II. But anyway, let's go.
where the pastors carry guns. And I've been around guns before. I grew up around hunters. This is a different thing where it's coupled with this sense of imminent fear and the end times. And it's also coupled, interestingly, often with the prosperity gospel and this sense that, okay, if you do the right thing, you're going to get money and cars and wealth. Now, again, too, this is distinct from this old time Southern religion necessarily. That's more this old school God, country, military. We see also what Trump did is
Well, are you not seeing the connections between like multi-level marketing and like the shit that Andrew Tate is doing? I mean, that's what it is. Oh, you're going to be rich and successful and really. I mean, my parents worked for several different churches, and usually the message was that it's God's will. Whatever happens to you, it's God's will. There were no guarantees of success. It was just be a good person so that you have a happy afterlife, right? But there were no guarantees in the current life that we were going to be successful and rich and so on and so forth. There was an expectation that we would tithe to the church because how else are they going to operate? And so they made all kinds of promises around tithing if you tithe. But the expectation was just you need to be a good person. So any church that's telling you you're going to get fortune by believing in their particular brand of religion is ridiculous. And that's the same sort of methodology that Andrew Tate has been using on young boys.
merge these two groups together. So you've got like the Paula Whites, the more global Pentecostal religion. And that's where we get this bringing in, especially of the end times and this sense we've got to defend ourselves for these coming end times. Certainly a weapon that has been used for a long time to justify a lot of corrupt religious leadership, whether it's Warren Jeffs in Utah or, Jim Jones in Jonestown.
Right.
I would submit that the corruption goes beyond those who have, literally preyed upon and in the case of a few like Jim Jones, murdered their followers. When you are taking from the poor to build your own estates and build, temples to your own personality, that might not be illegal, but it's certainly, I would argue, corrupt in any interpretation of the New Testament that I would agree with. There's this passage from your book that captures this really well, and I'd love your reaction to it. You say that we need to pay attention to the vocal minority of red state Christians, like the ones I met at the river at Tampa Bay, whose commitment to gun rights is based in fear, isolation, and an impending American Armageddon. That fear-based Christianity, your term, I see that all the time. What I can't make out is how to reconcile it with the prosperity gospel, or the idea that if you do certain things, there is an economic message coming from the pulpit in mega churches today. How do they square that with the idea that the world is ending?
I think, in just a really practical sense, you got to have a carrot and you got to have a stick, right?
Okay.
So some people are going to respond to the carrot, some people are going to respond to the stick. And also we have, that's the other thing that Trump was able to bring together is we have this worship of celebrity and fame and wealth in America. And that was shunned for a long time by American Christians, whether it goes all the way back to the Puritans. And so we've seen a real change, even with somebody like Jerry Falwell Jr., this embrace of wealth, or somebody like Bill Hybels, the megachurch movement, Rick Warren, this acceptance of Christianity of saying, like, it's good to be a billionaire.
Wow.
That's a hard sell on the Jesus of the New Testament.
It sure is convenient, though, for those at the top of that pyramid. For those who are unfamiliar, can you talk a little bit about the prosperity gospel and how they're able to pull it off?
Yep.
By the way, a great documentary if you're into, like, observing how these weird-ass cultist people do. There is, I don't know if it's still on, but, like, I watched it years ago. On Netflix, it's called Wild Wild Country, and it's about this Indian guru who came over to Oregon. They keep talking about red states, red Christianity. This was like something that was kind of bastardized on Buddhism, and they bought up their own property in Oregon and ended up basically having like terrorist battles with the local townsfolks who lived right next door. So they were, there was like bombs, there was guns, they had like military grade weapons. It was both factions, like both the elderly. It was a sleepy community where people went to retire. And they were fighting each other, and it's an amazing story. There's intrigue, there's death, there's murder. That it's all over the place of like how severely religion can go wrong, and how they were tormenting their neighbors, and the neighbors were not very good about accepting them into the community. That's a really good one. Another one that's actually, that one's a documentary, so that's real. That really happened. That's real footage that they have. And it's mostly extremely rich people that left their lives to join that religion and be a part of that commune. Really rich ass people, because you got to have a lot of money to be able to drop everything and do something like that. But there's another one that I really liked that's fictional. I can't remember if the Coen brothers made it or what, but I think it's called Red State, and that's another like cult movie that's hilarious. Okay, let's see what they have to say. This is long. I don't know if I'm going to cover the whole thing.
This is old, right? We call it the prosperity gospel. They called it the Tower of Babel at one point. This idea that we're gonna climb our way up to God. They had the golden calf at the time of Moses and Aaron. And I would say, for me, what I always try to remind American Christians is that this is not a uniquely American phenomenon. So when people want to say, oh no, this is just a partisan issue, this is between Democrats, Republicans, red states, blue states, I really want to remind people that for those of us who are American Christians, and even people who aren't, we have to look at Christian history all the way back to the Roman Empire. The early Christians, they're running for their lives. The Apostle Paul is in chains. He's writing most of his letters. And then in AD 300, so 300 years after the birth of Christ, the Roman Emperor Constantine, on his deathbed, takes on Christianity. And at that point, Christianity goes from being the persecuted religion of the empire who crucified Jesus to the religion of the empire. It goes on to become the Holy Roman Empire in Europe, the largest landowner in Europe. And so at that point, we see a hinge point in where Christianity becomes the religion of empire. And I think those are some of the same phenomenons that are happening with prosperity gospel indulgences that, my buddy Martin Luther spoke against 500 years ago. I think these are all of the same ilk, and it's all this hope and this dream that we can become God.
There is.
Did he really speak out against it, though? I mean, when you think about, like, they were the first Protestant religion against, like, the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church. She didn't say it. I don't know why, but it was the Roman Catholic Church. Was he really? I mean, basically, he only changed up a couple of things. It's not like he went against the scripture that was chosen by Constantine, right? So Constantine, if I'm remembering this correctly, was the emperor who decided which books would be included as part of the Bible, whereas the Gnostic Christians who existed before the Catholic Church actually had several more books that they also read that were not selected by Constantine to be a part of the Bible. And they had a completely different belief system about what happens when you die. That was also a very interesting program that I saw on, like, the History Channel or Discovery or something. All right, let's see how come she can't get Catholic out of her mouth? I mean, it was the Roman Catholic Church. What are you talking about?
Such a strong appeal to the idea of persecution within the church today, hearkening back to the church's early times, but it almost seems like another fetishization when you have, and examples of this are war on Christmas rhetoric, but you see it in a million other forms, the idea that Christians have this bunker mentality, and they almost seem to relish it. I shouldn't say Christians broadly, but the evangelical MAGA red state Christians that you write about love the idea of being in a bunker together, fending off slings and arrows as their own tribe. Is that just a historical?
Honestly, you guys, I think it's a little bit dangerous to keep throwing this out there as though it's all evangelicals, because that's not what it is. It's Pentecostals. And I think you should be specific in this conversation, because when we're talking about the type of religious people that are so over the edge that they're actually dangerous, I don't think you should group in all evangelicals into that conversation. Now, I don't particularly agree with most evangelicals' thought processes on religion, but I can be real that some of these super churches like Saddleback Church are not containing a bunch of dangerous people. They're just containing people who want to be able to drink coffee while they're listening to a rock band sing some religious music. It feels weird to me because, I grew up in a situation where I had a lot of incense around me. They were puffing out the incense constantly. We had to stand, we had to kneel, we had to sit down, we had to recite our prayers, we had to take communion. Some churches don't even do communion, or they don't have confession. Maybe they have communion, but they don't have confession. So there's, each church, these churches have different things that they do. And it's just up to, it's, if you want to be a part of that kind of church, whatever. Like, for instance, the Presbyterian church I went to, they gave us grape juice with bread as communion. Whereas when I go to a Catholic church, they want to give me a wafer, but I can only accept that wafer if I've gone to confession first, because it's considered a mortal sin if I take communion without confessing my sins first. There, each one of these churches have different things that are going on, but you can't just categorize all evangelical. Look, I'm a Catholic, so it's not like I even have, it's not like I have to defend anybody in this scenario because I'm not a part of their religion. But I don't think it's really fair to all evangelicals to categorize them together with what is more than likely Pentecostals. That's what you're describing, is people who are constantly in fear that the end of the world is coming, right? That's what you're talking about. You're talking about the people who are building their bunkers.
Wistfulness, or is there something else going on?
There's a there's a weird thing that's gone on. I think I've seen this since, I was a teenager, even maybe, where there's been some kind of benefit in whoever has got the claim for the most suffering. I mean, that you can probably relate to it in your time in politics of everybody grew up poor, everybody. um, so I think that, and just the claiming of, identity politics that maybe was initially something that was more prominent on the left, and I think has really shifted to now the Republican Party has become the party of identity politics. And so, from a Christian perspective and this sense of persecution, I think the way to really combat that, in one sense, is to really lift up the stories of folks who are currently experiencing persecution around the world for their faith. And I, was able to spend some time with Christians living in Bethlehem, and just hearing the stories of their lives and what they've faced to continue to be this Christian presence in the Holy Land. It
That's
pales
really
in
hard.
comparison to, the distinction of Happy Holidays versus Merry Christmas. And for pastors, if there's Christian leaders, ministry leaders, pastors who are listening, I think so much of this, when I talk to faith leaders, it's on us. How have we positively explained what the gospel is? Some folks have spent so much time saying what the gospel is not, but we haven't really explained what the gospel is. And when people have a strong sense for that, then you can locate yourself within where it is and step out of this sense of, feeling sorry for ourselves in a sense.
Yeah, I definitely want to get to the pushback that's happening within the church today, but that persecution complex is just so cynical.
Why do you guys keep talking about the church? What is the church to you? What is the church? Because, growing up for me, the only time that expression was used was in regards to the Catholic Church. And I don't think you've mentioned the Catholic Church once. What do you mean the church? What's the church? You're talking about Lutheran, you're talking about evangelicals, you're talking about Pentecostals. You can't group all of that together and call that the church. These are different religions. They're not all the church. What is the church?
And self-serving, especially when you compare it to real persecution that is happening abroad, when you talk about Christians, or in this country when you talk about LGBTQ plus communities. And the scariest thing for me is how these churches you
There we go.
study have extended that persecution complex to the entire country. And this passage from your book captures that. You say that red state Christians consider America and American Christianity under siege. Not just their church, but the country itself, resulting in a defensive pushback. Churches today must defend not just Jesus, but also America. The American flag and the Christian flag are posted side by side in sanctuaries across the country, often directly in front of the cross.
That is so weird. That is so weird. God does not care about your flag, your banner. You think God only loves Americans or something? Are you for real? Oh, God loves the American flag? That's where we're going? Oh my, I can't. Wow. You religious zealots need to fucking pull your heads out of your asses.
Heard you say it, and I think it bears reminding that Jesus was not American.
Yeah, I mean, there's no America in the Bible, believe it or not. What's come to me too,
You know what, though? It's in the Book of Mormon.
and this hasn't been necessarily an easy process for me. But so when I first began speaking about the book when it came out, and I spoke in a lot of what people would call conservative communities. I spoke to a lot of conservative churches, and I would say that Jesus is an American, and there'd be kind of like a silence. And the people would always laugh, like, "Oh yeah, of course he's not." But it was this moment where it would kind of probably.
Did they laugh when you told them he wasn't white either? Did they laugh when you told them that? Or did you not go that far?
To hear that in a sense, because Jesus has been, if you even look at some of the imagery that's used around, movements within the Christian right or movements in support of Trump, there's a lot of imagery that depicts Jesus as being American, Jesus as being a soldier for America. So it definitely bears repeating. What's happened for me since the book came out and in this transition to the new edition of the book is that I also felt really compelled to begin talking about how Jesus is also not white.
Oh, there we go.
And that, I grew up in Minnesota. I'm German and Scandinavian. The Jesus in my churches was blonde, I believe.
UCLA Extension is uniquely qualified to prepare students for the future, gain the latest skills, and launch a new career.
There we go.
And, I think that even that deeper truth helps white American Christians to decenter ourselves from the story of Christianity. And we for so long centered ourselves in that story when really, if you want to find white people in the Bible, maybe it's Pontius Pilate, maybe it's the Roman soldiers. That's about it. And so I think there's, for a long time I was one of those people that thought, we can't make everything about race. I live, just about 5 miles from where George Floyd was murdered. And so I think that was a real, watershed moment for me in really speaking plainly about the role of race and racism in this violent movement of Christianity, and also really speaking clearly about where Jesus is on that topic as well. And Jesus was not afraid to speak plainly about abuse and persecution.
Well, the historical Jesus really is a challenge to a lot of the values and the policy prescriptions offered by the churches you are talking about. Not only was he not white, he was a children of immigrants. He was persecuted for who he was and where he was from.
Yeah.
And
I'm
wondering how you're mentioning that in some of these churches is received. There is clearly pushback, even among evangelicals, against this adoption of militancy and racist subtexts. How is that internal conflict playing out right now?
Well, our Christianity has become, I think, even more polarized, in the years since I've written the book. So there's a lot of places that, just would never have me come speak. Like the places that are going to have the most pushback are going to be probably avoiding having me there, or, engaging with my work. However, I will say that, I do get messages and notes from folks who are kind of stepping out of some of the ideology that they've received in mega churches and in evangelical churches. And I'll say too, there's such a soft sell, especially in a lot of these large, wealthy suburban churches that are ultimately pushing a lot of anti-women messaging, a lot of misogynist messaging, a lot of violent messaging. There's a very soft sell, especially to families. And so they sort of draw in folks with we've got this great place for kids and it's this beautiful building and we've got this awesome music. And then people find themselves there, and then all of a sudden they'll hear something. I've had this, happen with friends of mine, and they'll be like, "Oh my gosh, I had no idea that this church didn't support gay marriage, or that this church was, this pastor was such a huge Trump supporter." So I think that again, there's that would not happen in a smaller local.
I mean, I've attended some of these mega churches, and I think it's, I don't know, I don't go all that often. Let's be real, I'm not much of a church attendee anymore. But the times that I have attended, they do pretty much what all other churches do, which is they pick out a couple of passages. There's usually a reading from the Old Testament, there's a reading from the New Testament, and there's a sermon. The sermon is going to be where the reverend decides what sort of knowledge he or she, depending on the church you're at, wants to impart to the congregation. I think it's pretty rare for them to get that political in front of a congregation, at least in if you're not in the Bible Belt. The Bible Belt, I don't know. I haven't attended church there. They might get a little crazier about what they do with their sermons, but that's where they would impart those messages. But the mega churches that I have had the misfortune of attending were in California and Arizona, and they never abused their position like that, where they would be promoting politics like that. They do have their various messages, but I've never sat in on a sermon at any church that actually attacked the LGBTQIA community straight up in front of the congregation. So if that's happening, it's got to be happening like in the Bible Belt or maybe the Midwest or something. But it's certainly not happening in rational states. I'm sorry to call it that, but I mean, if that's how y'all roll, then we are in the rational states, because that's unreasonable to attack people as part of your sermon, to attack people while you're preaching religion. That is not what Jesus was doing. He told us to love everybody, to turn the other cheek, to be charity, like do charity instead of like volunteer, be good do-gooders. That's just shocking to me that anybody could sit in a church, listen to a hateful message, and be like, yep, this is what religion is. Let's roll.
Congregation, because people would be knowing who their pastor is and knowing who one another is. But in these large churches, of which I've served in the past, you can be more anonymous, and people don't know each other, and people don't speak to the pastor directly. The pastor almost becomes sort of like this unreachable godlike figure. So I think that contributes to a lot of sense of...
I think celebrity is a better term for that. I mean, I'd be surprised if the majority of the congregation actually looked at the pastor as some sort of godlike figure. I don't know. Obviously, you're the theologian here. You've done the research. But that would be very surprising to me if people took it so seriously that they actually believed them to be like superhuman.
Information, and people just kind of find themselves getting swept up into things. And then, as you heard on, if you ever listened to the Mars Hill podcast that Christianity Today put out, people, when they try to disentangle themselves from this movement, that's all their friendships, that's all their clubs. They get they've given so much money. And so I think that much of this process of stepping away from Christian nationalism for people, it's like a recovery process. It's like a 12-step process. It's like this, and it's much more of a therapeutic process rather than like, let's get in.
Well, just say it. It's a cult then, right? Come out and say it. If this is how extreme it gets for these people, it's a cult. Say it.
argument and I'm going to convince you rationally to change your mind. It's not really a mind issue.
Well, you haven't said it this way, but everything you are describing suggests cult deprogramming.
Yeah, and I think that so much of religion in general can be considered, cult like. We have to be really careful. And Jesus was aware of that as well, like, criticizing in the religious hierarchy of his day. So I guess, I'm kind of hesitant to like throw that term around at people, being a pastor myself. But
that's what
it is a lot. I listen to a lot of cult podcasts. So
what does it take to successfully guide people away from that distorted gospel, acknowledging that the reason the MAGA gospel is preached at these mega churches is because it works. It's attractive in some way. It's certainly lucrative. It is incredibly effective. We can just look at the numbers and the growth of these churches for evidence of that. How do you counter something that alluring?
I think part of it too is just the sort of homogenization politically of a lot of our communities and a lot of our churches. So when you're surrounded by folks that all think the same way as you, it feels, if you're starting to have doubts, it's really easy to push those down, and it's really scary to raise those doubts when you don't feel like anyone else is there. And so that's why I've often said too, like, I spent the last 3 years, I lived in a pretty progressive neighborhood of Southwest Minneapolis. And then I drove an hour west to serve a congregation in rural Minnesota, where 2/3 of the county voted for Trump in 2020. And so I, spent a lot of time in both of these sort of polarized worlds. And what I saw was that we deeply kind of need each other, and also that it's important to listen to minority political voices in communities. And so that's why I so support the work of people who are encouraging, especially like the Democratic Party, to re-engage in rural America, to listen to the voices of folks who are, and I think Barack Obama did that pretty effectively. It's like, maybe you're not going to win this county, but you're going to get a little bit of a more divided electorate, a little bit larger minority. And I do think that just when other people have the sense for that there's space to have pushback in these conversations, there are churches who are going to offer an alternative. People want that. Sometimes they're just not aware that it's possible.
Thanks for watching, everyone. We've got a quick message from our show sponsor. But first, I've got a favorite.
Well, I guess he's still got like 20 minutes on this video, but if he's going to go to a commercial, I'll end it here because I'm tired anyway. Interesting discussion on religion. I feel like some of the terminology they were using was incorrect. I think that, I'm not an evangelical myself, but I think that the conversation there was using the wrong terminology, because it's not like all evangelicals are Trump people who hate on everybody else around them. I don't think that's exactly what's going on. I think evangelicals are just like mostly centrists, mostly probably right-leaning centrists for the most part, from my experience of being around some of these mega churches. But I can't speak to the Bible Belt because I most fortunately never had to deal with that. I've never lived in the middle of the country where they have the people who are most likely to participate in cult type religions, but I don't think they're using the appropriate term by calling them all evangelicals, because I know evangelicals and they're not that crazy. They're not that crazy. Now, you want to get into the Pentecostal discussion, Jehovah's Witness, Seventh-day Adventists. There's there's a bunch of religions out there that are way off the deep end when it comes to constantly expecting the second coming of Christ. But yeah, I mean, like, how do you line up your belief system if you believe that you need to hate on everybody around you when that's not what the teachings of Christ were? And you're also supposed to be a good person, charitable, and doing well in society to help other people. And that is, I mean, those were his teachings, right? That's what you were supposed to be doing. And if you think he's going to be coming down at any moment to judge you, because that is like, I mean, go to the book of Revelations, like, check it out. There, you're going to be judged, and purgatory. That's what I was looking for earlier. Heaven, purgatory, or hell, right? And in purgatory, I think you get like burned up for a long ass time until you finally have atoned for your sins. This is why it's like, none of us know what's going to happen. It could be lights out. It could be lights out. We don't know. All we can do is hope that the things that our parents told us when we were growing up, that, when you die, you're going to be with your loved ones. I really hope that's true. I really hope that's true, that I get to be with my loved ones. But I have no idea. And the older I get, the more I realize that the humans who run religions, who are at the top, the leadership, they're just as flawed as I am. So how can I believe that they have some sort of deeper knowledge? I don't know that that is necessarily the case. And I don't want to doubt them. I want to give them the benefit of the doubt. But I'm certainly not going to trust any religion that tells me to hate people. Not going to happen.